Sandringham House, Norfolk. The 14th of January, 1892. In an upstairs room, a chaplain leans over a bed and reads the prayers for the dying. The man in the bed is 28. 6 days ago, this house celebrated his birthday. 3 doctors stand at the foot of the bed. They have run out of things to try. Around them wait his mother, his younger brother, and the woman he was weeks from marrying. In his lungs, influenza, a common respiratory infection. The same influenza that had swept through Berlin, Paris, and London, and that most people caught, cursed, and survived. His name is Albert Victor. He is Queen Victoria's grandson, and second in line to the British throne. He will not see the morning. This is his case file. The illness killing him already had a name. The newspapers called it the Russian flu. It was not Russian. It had appeared 3 years earlier, in the spring of 1889, in a city most of Europe could not have placed on a map. From there, it did something no disease had ever done at this speed. It circled the planet in about 4 months. By the time it reached England, its dead were already in the hundreds of thousands, climbing toward 1 million. Then the reports thinned, and the panic passed. But the disease did not. For the next few years it kept coming back, each return quieter than the last. One of them, in the winter of 1891 to 1892, reached an upstairs room at Sandringham, and the second in line to the British throne, attended by the best physicians in England. For 100 years, no one questioned what it had been. It was influenza. Then, someone looked again. It began in the spring of 1889 in Bukhara, a trading city in Central Asia, then part of the Russian Empire. A physician there, Oscar Heifelder, watched a fever move through the population and wrote down what he saw. He was watching the start of a pandemic. He could not have known it, because nothing in medical history had moved the way this was about to. The reason was steel. The Trans-Caspian Railway had recently been laid across the desert, and the fever climbed aboard. It reached Samarkand by August, and Tomsk, more than 3,000 kilometers away, by October. Where the rails ran, the disease ran. Where they stopped, it slowed. Investigators tracing its path noticed it followed roads, rivers, and above all railway lines, and drew the correct conclusion. This was not carried on the wind. It was carried by people. If it moved with people, then in theory, it could be stopped by stopping them. But it travelled at the speed of the trains, faster than any warning could run ahead of it, and by the time a city learned, the town down the line had fallen, its own first cases were already in bed. The men tracing it reached the obvious conclusion. As long as people moved freely between cities, nothing would hold it back. By November 1889, it had reached St. Petersburg, moving up the Volga trade routes. In a city of under 1 million, an estimated 180,000 fell ill. Deaths there peaked on the 1st of December. Then, something happened that had not happened before. Russian officials wired the news west by telegraph, and Europe's newspapers began printing the pandemic's progress, city by city, like a storm front tracked toward a coast. A reader in London in December 1889 could open a paper and watch the disease approach. Berlin, then Vienna, then Paris, each edition closer. No one had ever watched an epidemic arrive from 1,000 miles off. Now everyone could, and the watching changed to nothing. It arrived on schedule. In Berlin, about half the city fell ill. In London, roughly a quarter of the population took to their beds. In Paris, an estimated 180,000 people fell ill. The Hôtel Dieu hospital filled past capacity. Tents rose in its gardens, and nearly every doctor on staff caught the disease. Then it crossed the Atlantic. The first American death was recorded in Canton, Massachusetts, in early December. Within weeks, it was in Boston and New York, and then it did in America what it had done everywhere, following the railroads inland to Chicago, to Denver, to San Francisco. American deaths peaked in the week of the 12th of January, 1890. The country's toll was around 13,000. In roughly 4 months, the fever from Bukhara had crossed the entire northern hemisphere. It was the fastest a disease had ever traveled. The reason was plain. For the first time, the disease and the people carrying it were moving at the same new speed. By the spring of 1890, the first wave had passed. It was not the last. The one that reached Sandringham came in the winter of 1891 into 1892. After a New Year's party, Albert Victor took to his bed with influenza. Within days, it became pneumonia, an inflammation of the lungs' air sacs that fills them with fluid. He was young and attended by the most senior physicians in the country. It made no difference. There were no antivirals, no antibiotics, and no agreement even on what kind of organism was doing this. On the 14th of January, the second in line to the British throne died of the same illness that clerks and dock workers across London had survived and forgotten. The disease did not distinguish between them. It never had. That was the whole of its power. The influenza diagnosis had always been a guess. No one isolated a virus in 1890. The means to do it were decades away. So the label held for the better part of a century. Unchallenged, mostly because no one thought to challenge it. Then, in 2005, virologists in Belgium challenged it almost by accident. They were sequencing the genome of a human coronavirus called OC43, one of 4 coronaviruses that circulate constantly in people, causing nothing worse than a common cold. Compared against a coronavirus found in cattle, the two were nearly identical. OC43 had crossed into humans from cows, and recently enough that its genetic clock could still be read. The method is molecular dating. A virus mutates at a roughly steady rate, so the number of differences between 2 related viruses estimates how long ago they split. The estimate for when OC43 entered the human population landed on a single decade, around 1890. That is the year of the Russian flu, and in the years just before it, a respiratory disease had been moving through cattle herds worldwide, forcing mass slaughter and putting enormous numbers of people in close contact with sick animals. For 15 years, that was where it rested. A coincidence in a virology journal, and little more. Then came 2020. A new coronavirus, the one behind COVID-19, moved through the world the way the thing from Bukhara once had. Researchers went back and read the case notes from 1889 again. What the Victorian doctors had described no longer read only like influenza. There were patients who lost their sense of smell and taste, others left with lasting neurological damage, and many who stayed ill and exhausted for years after the fever had passed. So a second possibility now sits beside the first. The pandemic that emptied cities and killed a man in line to the British throne may not have been influenza at all. It may have been a coronavirus, one that arrived, killed roughly 1 million people, and then, over generations, settled quietly into human life. The theory is not proven. There is no tissue from 1890 left to test, and in 2023, a fresh analysis argued the molecular dates are too shaky to trust. The honest answer is that no one knows for certain what the Russian flu was. But if the virologists are right, the descendant of that pandemic is not in a museum. It is in circulation. It is one of the ordinary colds that pass through schools and offices every winter, including, quite possibly, yours. The Russian flu killed an estimated 1 million people and then left the front pages. It never took on the mythology of the Black Death or of the 1918 influenza that followed it a generation later. In memory, it became just a bad flu. What it left behind was a template. It was the first pandemic of the railway age, and it proved that the speed of travel now set the speed of contagion. Every pandemic since has obeyed that rule, only faster. Albert Victor was buried at Windsor on the 20th of January, 1892. His younger brother, George, moved into his place in the line of succession. In time, he also took his fiancée. Mary of Teck married George instead, and in 1910 they were crowned King George V and Queen Mary. The woman who would have been one king's queen became his brother's. It was not the first time an English succession had turned this way. In 1502, Arthur, Prince of Wales, died at 15 of an epidemic fever. The sweating sickness, by most accounts, and his younger brother Henry took both his place in the line and, in time, his widow, Catherine of Aragon. Nearly 4 centuries later, the same sequence ran again at Sandringham. The illness that rearranged the British succession was never named beyond influenza, and no one was ever asked to answer for it, because there was no one to ask. It was a virus, moving through a world that had just built the perfect machine to move it. The maps the investigators drew of the disease running down the rail lines survive in the Library of Congress. They are among the first pictures of a pandemic behaving like a modern one. The world named it after a country it never came from, decided it was only the flu, and forgot it. And if the molecular clocks are right, it never actually left, only grew quieter with each generation, until it became one of the small illnesses we no longer trouble to fear. One question for the comments: which of the winter illnesses you no longer fear might once have emptied a city? The next case on this channel: a man shot in the stomach, kept alive through a wound that never closed, and the doctor who spent years studying it. Subscribe, and the next case opens for you first. This is the sealed ward.